Our next panel is Beyond PGP, Protecting Reporters on an Institutional Level, which I'm hoping will build on some of the things we talked about right before this. And I'm going to introduce our moderator and panelists. Our moderator is Marcia Hofmann. She's an attorney in private practice in San Francisco, where she litigates, writes, and speaks about a broad range of technology law issues, including computer security, electronic privacy, and free expression. She previously was a senior staff attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where she's currently special counsel, and is a non-residential fellow at the Stanford Law School Center for Internet and Society. She is also an adjunct professor at UC Hastings College of Law, which makes me wish I was still in law school. Nabiha Syed is an associate at Levine, Sullivan, Koch, and Schulz, LLP. She was previously the First Amendment Fellow in the New York Times Company's legal department. She co-founded and directed Yale Law School's Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic, and she has a master's degree in comparative media law and policy from Oxford, where she was a Marshall Scholar. Next to her, we have Morgan Marquis-Boire, who's a security researcher and director of security for First Look Media and a contributor to The Intercept. He's also a senior researcher and technical advisor to the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. He previously worked on the security team at a small company known as Google. He's a member of the Freedom of the Press Foundation's Technical Advisory Board. Next to him, we have Xeni Jardin, who's founding partner and co-editor of Boing and a longtime online journalist. She's also a member of the Freedom of the Press Foundation's board and has been a contributor to NPR, Wired, The New York Times, LA Times, Guardian, CNN, MSNBC, and many other online outlets and print outlets. Xeni's work focuses on technology, culture, and digital media. And finally, we have Jack Gillum, who's a reporter on the Associated Press's DC Investigations Desk, focusing on the intersection of technology and privacy. Some of his work utilizes computer-assisted reporting, and he's also a web developer and programmer. He previously was a database editor at USA Today. So without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out this morning, everybody. I'm thrilled to get to moderate this panel. It's full of just absolute stars. One of the things that strikes me is that you all are involved with working with very different types of media organizations. And just to kick it off, I'd be curious to hear everybody's thoughts about how, from your perspective, you believe media organizations can best support journalists on an institutional level. Do you want to start, Xeni?
Sure, I'll tackle that. Boing is my home base, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Boing, we began 25 years ago this year as a print zine. We've always been a labor of love. We only turned into a business in, I think, 2003, 3 years after we went from print to being a blog, a website, back when they were called weblogs. And we still remain a small, I say this jokingly, but it's accurate, a distributed anarchist collective. There's, I think, 5 core partners. Sometimes I lose track, but 5 of us who are basically actively involved in managing the business and managing the editorial. We're all over the world. And there's a smattering of contractors and friends and freelancers who help us produce this. But we're an awfully small organization. We've never taken $1 of VC funding, and it's sort of like your cool, weird friends, record shop in the 80s. We're not, Walmart. So we're very lucky that some, like Cory Doctorow, one of my partners in particular, his whole life is really dedicated to the issues that we're talking about here, and he tends to lead internally a lot of our, a lot of the good decisions that we've made about security and about protecting our users' security. But when in the earlier panel, people were talking about, well, you have free software on one side of the spectrum, which works well, but is sometimes difficult for non-tech users to wrap their heads around. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have really well-funded tools that have an opaque layer that makes it very easy for end users. Those cost a lot of money. Somewhere in between, there's a gap for freelancers, for instance, in our organization, who, they don't know from Linux, but they do need to be able to communicate securely. And I think it's really easy, in the interest of saving money, in the interest of just fast, which we live and die by, to use free tools that are neither of those things, and they're not secure. So there's a real temptation to get sloppy.
Right. And Morgan, you are working with First Look Media, which is in the enviable position of getting to build a media organization from the ground up with technical assistance from people like you and from Micah Lee, who are very technically sophisticated. And you also come at this from an interesting perspective because you are a security professional, but you also do reporting. What is your take on this?
Yeah, so we also just hired Aaron Clark from the Tor project. So growing a security team actually, I think, is, in terms of the way a news organization can institutionally support its reporters, what I've actually found to be very interesting is the kind of glue in between sort of, I guess, reporters and security resource. Because what I sort of noticed is so joining a media organization from 15 years of being a security engineer for mostly sort of large corporates or consulting and that sort of thing is perhaps there is a lack of ease with which media organization and reporters consume security resource, which has actually been very interesting to me. So I think having it abundant and available in a news organization is a really great idea, because one of the things that I've noticed is that reporters mainly want to report. There are people who take a certain amount of enjoyment and pride in learning how to use secure communication tools and actually sort of enjoy the geekery around it. For a lot of people, though, this is simply an inconvenience, right? I ended up talking to someone who was telling me that they'd tried to labor through learning various types of encryption tools and so forth themselves, and they'd given up after sort of a morning because they had stuff to write, And so I kind of spend a lot of time thinking about how I and my team can protect our journalists kind of as seamlessly as possible. Admittedly, when you don't have a massive amount of institutional cruft and overhead to deal with, that allows you to be a bit more fluid in this type of endeavor.
Speaking of which, Jack, you work for the AP, which is a much larger organization. How does your experience differ?
So, can you hear me okay? This is like 500 pounds. The AP is so old, it was literally, we were at Custer's Last Stand. We're an old news organization. We're all around the world. And, change goes slowly. And the AP, to its credit, has done a lot internally to try to, particularly Snowden, to get up to speed. Our Chris Seguin had pointed out that the FBI impersonated an AP story. Our general counsel sent a scathing letter to the FBI about that, saying that it, fundamentally undermines, the independence of a free press. And we do take this very seriously. But I think there's sort of two things, and this is not really speaking about the AP, but other, large news organizations I've worked for, or news organizations who are owned by big companies, is that there's sort of two things we need to think about here before we get into the tools. A, we need to stop being cheap. And what makes me irritated about this, quite frankly, is that we spend so much money on making sure the doors are locked. We have all these fancy proximity cards. We give, whatever like fancy ways to physically secure stuff. But then when it comes to PGP just alone, which by the way, free tools are great, but when we use Microsoft Outlook on Microsoft Exchange, trying to force feed PGP with that is a nightmare. And I have a little bit of a CS background, and if I can't do it, sure as heck somebody who's been working there 30 years and doesn't know how to use an iPhone, I feel sorry for them, and that's the whole issue we've come up to. And it shouldn't be that difficult, but there are paid solutions. The other thing I think, at the AP, we have a lot of reporters in countries who don't exactly have a First Amendment, and who could, either they or their sources will literally be killed if some information gets out in some of these countries. And I think we need to have this mindset of security, that it's beyond just the tools. It's not an either or. It's not just the tools. It's not just, the parking garage in Roslyn. It's this idea that we live in almost now 2015. It's clear that, our government, other governments collect, a massive metadata trail about our lives, that, even just getting to that parking garage, who knows, between the Metro card we tap and the 50 surveillance cameras that pick us up and, the 3 meetings you had with a source in which you used your credit card and they were able to put you at the scene if you went Dutch. We need to think a little better about security, and I think just having that mindset before we even get to the tools and realizing that we need to spend money to protect our sources because we owe it to them to do that, I think are 2 things that it seems obvious, but I think we need to really have that discussion.
Well, and that makes me think of Morgan again, because in your capacity at Google, I believe, you released a study earlier this year finding that 21 of 25 top media organizations have been targeted by state-sponsored hacking. Is that right?
Yeah.
What can we learn from that? What can media organizations take away from that?
Yeah, so a primary concern of mine, I guess, has been sort of targeted threats. It's important to just think, it's like we've heard a lot about the use of PGP and secure communications tools, right? And this protects you from a specific type of threat, of problem, a specific type of actor, right? And this is the type of person or actor that is listening to your communications as they occur across a telephone, across chat, However, I've spent a lot of time studying what I would call targeted threats, and these are people that will actively attempt to penetrate a news organization or an individual's sort of digital life or devices. And so, for instance, I've published a bunch of research on, this generally takes the form of, say, a software implant, which would get installed silently on a device like an iPad or a cell phone, and then would do all sorts of wonderful things like turn on the microphone so you can listen to conversations that are ambient to the person using it, or turn on the webcam, copy communications, contacts, and that sort of thing. And so obviously this level of surveillance is desirable on people on the previous panel, at news organizations and so forth. And so what happens is people in this sort of so-called post-Snowden world, people are very obsessed with the capabilities of the NSA. However, there's a whole bunch of governments that are very much in the business of targeted hacking. The activities of China towards news organizations are sort of reasonably well documented. But yeah, so essentially, as Marcia said, we discovered that 21 out of 25 news organizations had actually been targeted, if not actually penetrated by state-sponsored, essentially, spies. This, I guess, shows the ubiquity of this threat. The ones of that top 25 that had not found to be targeted were people that mainly had a focus on sports and entertainment, unsurprisingly. And so I guess we need to not think of these as isolated events. This is reasonably continuous. It's merely the discovery of these actors that are isolated events. And that's the scary thing, right? Is that occasionally people slip up and they get noticed, or other more skilled people detect that intrusions have occurred on their network and actually have visibility into the other activities of these actors. So I think it's really a wake-up call for news organizations. It's easier to not look at it because the solution involves, as mentioned, lots of resource, be it security professionals, money, and so forth.
And all these news organizations are just rolling in cash.
I hear print journalism is just making mad stacks now.
I will say, as someone who's positioned in private practice, I hear about these issues only when someone calls me and I get a barrage of questions. And it makes me wonder how much, so when I get these questions, it's often, well, a reporter walks into my office and asks me about tool X, or IT is reporting that we have issue Y, and what do I need to know about this? And I think this kind of ad hoc approach is part of the problem. There needs to be a more systemic, it doesn't necessarily need to be top down, but I think just having this bottom up kind of approach of, okay, well, that reporter wants it, so IT go and set him up with whatever he needs is not enough anymore. I mean, there are enough incidences, there's enough evidence to say that this needs to be an institutional solution, even though no one has any money. It is probably a priority that I think is worth at least some money, which is more than what it's getting in most organizations right now that I talk to.
I would love to follow up on that. You represent, as a lawyer in private practice, a number of media organizations, I suspect all sizes, different approaches toward their craft. When you get these calls and they're asking you questions about digital security, I'd be curious how you approach them, especially considering that, you know, I feel like we're in an environment these days where some of the legal protections that we'd like to see for journalists and for sources really aren't as robust as we'd like them to be. And so, you know, on one level, the legal protections aren't what we'd like to see, but some of the technical protections maybe have greater potential. How do you navigate those issues?
So the questions I tend to get come in three big chunks. So the first are complaints about convenience, which kind of came up on that first panel of, you know, someone in my organization is saying we need to use this, and isn't this just for the national security reporters? Why do I have to do this for everybody? And it seems very inconvenient. I can't check my email on my phone. I don't like this. I don't want to do it. And so in those questions, part of it is just counseling about why it's important and what the importance is for not just your national security reporters, but anyone who crosses a border, anyone who does a variety of different kinds of reporting. This is important for you, and you need to have this available. The second is kind of this comprehension or comprehensiveness issue. So someone will say, okay, well, I know about encrypted email, so we can set that up. That's all I need, right? And you're like, well, actually, your content is stored in a variety of means, and there's a variety of forms of communication, right? You have chat, you have telephone, you have the storage of your information, you have how you browse, you have everything. And it's not just how you do all of that in the United States, but also when you have bureaus or reporters that are in places like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, where even having this can be a crime, you need to think about the policies your organization has. If you tell a reporter, yeah, take your computer with PGP on it and just head to Karachi, they may have some problems when they're crossing that border, so you need to think about that.
So I'd like to actually, I think this is a really, really awesome point, right? Like we need to move away from the PGP is all you need sort of focus, I think, in this community, away from a tools-based focus. So security is a holistic organizational thing, and there's legal implications, policy implications, and that type of thing. I think the greatest value add of having a dedicated security team is not having people around that can teach people to use PGP, but people that can teach reporters to think logically and sanely about security. And that's not being paralyzed by fear of the Chinese government turning on the microphone on your phone, but realizing the likelihood that that threat will happen to you and the steps that you should take to prevent it.
I would just, on this point, I think, you know, it's easy to sort of, and in fact, you know, colleagues in the industry who don't cover national security or political reporters, for example, it's very easy for them to say, well, I don't cover the NSA, I don't need to worry about this. Incorrect. You do need to worry about this for no other reason than whether you're working in government, whether you're, you know, when I say they, whether you, I mean like a source, is either working in government, forget about the federal government, state, local governments. I mean, you know, private companies. I mean, I'm sure you've rooted out, you know, leakers before. I mean, the idea is that these are people with jobs and mortgages and families to support. And, you know, who's to say that a political source now, for example, won't be somebody when, you know, the person they're working for in 2 years runs for president and drops, you know, the Romney 47% video. And let's say they you know, instead of, you know, riding that wave out, and let's say this candidate this time really wants to aggressively go after and sue you and, you know, compel you civilly to produce this. I mean, you know, maybe you can quash that subpoena, maybe you can get thrown away, but what if it's not? I mean, they'll pull all your Outlook contacts and figure out who you've been contacting in these last few years. And I think it's just that, I'm not saying that all that means you're going to have you're going to be subpoenaed one day, but you need to think that if this is somebody who you really care about, which should be all of your sources, it applies to you if you're not just covering, you know, the intelligence community, I think.
The issues that we're talking about today are not just a matter of individual hygiene. They're a matter of organizational security hygiene. An organization is only as secure as the weakest person who has access to the CMS, and that could be the cat video blogger, you know? Yeah, the other thing I wanted to share, about a year and a half ago, I was in Guatemala for month, 2 months, covering a major genocide trial that was happening there, a historic trial. And I learned a lesson in a new way that many reporters have learned, that you can only be as secure as how low you're willing to go in order to talk to a source. So in Guatemala, I learned that, and in Guatemala, political activism, performing journalism, this is no joke. People die. People die for trying to do the right thing all the time, and nobody cares. It's a killer's paradise, as they say. But some of the very, very brave activists who are organizing witnesses from these massacres to come to court to speak their truth, they're communicating over WhatsApp. They're communicating over text. And the phone carriers there are, it's not a metaphorical monopoly. It is, in fact, a monopoly, and it is pretty much directly controlled by the same people who control the government and the military. So how do you go about practicing good reporter OPSEC in a place where people are at extraordinary risk for their actions, but the only way, the absolute only way to make first contact, and sometimes consecutive contact, is to break most of your own rules. And by the way, when I came back from that trip, I had done work that I was proud of, but I also, I remember it was like 3 days after I came back, and this was right before the big Snowden, the first big Snowden revelation. I logged into a Gmail account that I use for, I know, I got the warning that my Gmail had been compromised by a state-sponsored attacker. And who knows?
This was my old team, actually.
You would never tell me who it was. To this day, I wonder, does Guatemala have an elite band of hackers? Was it China, who's pissed off at something I did long ago about the Tibetan human rights movement? Or was it the US?
Sounds like you have a problem with making people angry.
I think the answer is yes. It's probably all three.
That's very interesting. So Jack, I understand you mentioned you have a computer science background.
Yeah, I didn't have any friends as a kid, so I didn't. So.
And I think
Not kidding.
I think everybody on this panel is relatively tech savvy. For the first time, just a moment ago, Snowden's name actually came up, which I thought would come up like instantly on this panel. But I'm curious how much you think things have really changed in the post-Snowden world. I mean, has that really changed everything, or are we just more aware of the risks? Or what do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's changed quite a bit, for sure. I mean, I mean, just the idea of having, the SecureDrop. I mean, just going to the front page of the Washington Post, and it's right there on their homepage. I'm not saying without Snowden that wouldn't have happened, but it certainly was a big impetus for it. Reporters I talked to who, at one point barely know how to open Excel and sort a spreadsheet are like, I should be a little more secure. What's this PGP thing I hear about? So it's in the milieu. I think people do talk about it. But again, it comes down to the tools and how hard they are to use. But at the same time, I don't think that's a barrier. I mean, even institutionally, news organizations, I think, even if we don't have like a site-wide PGP installation, everybody has OTR in their computers, we still, when I was, working with a colleague in a, let's just say, not very friendly country, we downloaded and used, first it was Silent Circle, then we used Signal. And, first one was $9.95 a month, the other one is free. And so I feel like it's also easy for reporters, to say, well, nobody's installing this on my computer, I can't do it. Well, no, I mean, there's ways you can ad hoc sort of, if you want to make it secure and you understand that this needs to be a better OPSEC sort of, environment for yourself. I feel like now, since Snowden, there are more tools out there for journalists. Certainly the Freedom of the Press Foundation and others have like made this available, EFF and others have like, here's how you do it. It may be a little bit of a brain power exercise because again, it's not very easy, but there are tools, even Julia mentioned, the scorecard of like, here are the tools you can use and, here are their limitations, here are how good they are. I mean, it's available now. And so let's start using them now.
I'm a proud board member of Freedom of the Press Foundation, and just as a point of clarification, the organization launched before the Edward Snowden document dump and revelations, but some of the tools that the organization has worked very hard to make available to reporters, and some of the support that it has provided to investigative news organizations. That really, it was like everything that happened around Edward Snowden sort of created this massive tide of public interest that opened up a new kind of public awareness for why these issues matter to everyone.
Did you have something to add?
I do have some feelings on this, which I think is because the Snowden revelations have meant that people have definitely started threat modeling more widely, which I think is great. For a lot of people, this has meant that they've been doing it since June 5th, 2013, which is actually not a very long time. Additionally, people who aren't trained or experienced in this area, I think, tend to worry about threat in the same way that people who aren't trained to do it worry about risk, and that we get freaked out about novelty, right? Like, we're really worried about terrorist attacks because they're really visceral and they involve blood and bombs. We're a lot less concerned with car accidents, heart disease, and, you know, lung cancer or whatever. Well, we're very concerned about Ebola, despite, like, you know, incidents of death in this country being very low. But I mean, as I said, I see the same thing in this sort of the post-Snowden world, in that I have so many conversations with people that are really concerned with defeating the NSA. And I'd really love to hear why they think the NSA is actually their greatest threat, or why they're being, like, I mean, if you live in America and you think you're being targeted specifically by the NSA, like, your problem is that you're being targeted by an insurmountable adversary with $1 trillion budget, right? Like, this is worrying, right? Like, you should probably have a meltdown or something. I mean, I guess I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of people are very worried about things that they haven't managed to clarify to me why they think they're actually risks or threats. So I think it's great that people are thinking in this way. I think the conversation will slowly get saner over the next couple of years.
The only time that Boing Boing was ever pwned, to my knowledge, to our knowledge, was not by the NSA, but by some very bored teenagers who replaced our front page with a photograph of a guy in a rubber suit with penises coming out of it.
What is it? You know.
We call it the cock suit to this day.
What is it that Corey
And
actually said? Never underestimate someone who is cash poor but time rich.
And Corey was right, and it was just a matter of an unpatched installation of, I think, movable type, which was a whole discussion in and of itself. We should have never.
If I could say one thing too, I mean, keep in mind, you know, pre-Snowden or around the time of Snowden, keep in mind, I mean, the AP was subpoenaed by the Justice Department for their phone records. For phone records, okay? We're not talking about PGP, I mean, we're talking about emails that the NSA with, you know, unlimited budget is trying to crack out in Utah. We're talking about phone records, and, you know, who knows what else the government is trying to get after under this administration or others. And I think since then, you know, whether it was that, others, we do have this sort of, you know, okay, well, how can we be better at this? Is it slow moving? Yes, but I mean, it's great that since Snowden there are tools available. So, but you're right, it's not just about the tool. It's not like the NSA is out to get you. It's just, you know, like I was saying earlier, I think you need to have a better idea, or just this sort of just not be stupid about security. You know, like don't you know, if a buddy of mine is, you know, if a colleague is in, you know, a really, you know, adversarial country, don't use your cell phone to make a landline phone call into the United States. You know, like don't sit at a Starbucks and use unencrypted Wi-Fi to start doing, you know what I mean? Like, just little things, but frankly, I think news organizations, and I'm not necessarily speaking about the AP, because we've done a good job, I think, internally of trying to get better, but others, like particularly like reporters who don't cover Washington, I feel like it's pretty lackluster, just in my conversations with them. So
On the subpoena point, that's been one really funny development over the last year, where people say, okay, well, the law is terrible, the Fourth Circuit doesn't have a First Amendment defense anymore, or any reporter's privilege, so we're just going to use technology instead. That encryption is just going to solve everything. And it's not clear to me where that is coming from, because if you get a subpoena, let's game it out if you're in the Fourth Circuit and you get a subpoena for your content, one of the lessons of Lavabit is that prosecutors are not afraid to ask you for any keys or any passwords or anything they need to decrypt your information. So they will ask for that, and if you are in the position of having to quash that subpoena, the First Amendment argument that you would make is no longer there in this jurisdiction. And in some cases, there have been people who have used Fifth Amendment arguments to try to quash the subpoena. And when it comes to compelled decryption of hard drives or passwords, there is an emerging body of case law that's not exactly favorable. There are some rough cases out there that do say, no, in fact, you can't invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege to avoid having to submit decrypted versions of the content. And so it's not clear that any of this tech stuff can really keep you safe from that particular legal threat that exists. It's very helpful for certain kinds of risk, right? If anyone's trying to have unauthorized access or if it's foreign government or whatever, but the legal issue is still pretty terrible and it's still something we need to work on.
For the non-lawyers in the room, do you want to just explain a little bit about what the Fifth Amendment situation is?
Sure. So basically the Fifth Amendment protects you against having to provide testimony that would be self-incriminating. And so in this handful of cases, there's a question here about whether having to give up your password or key, and courts use them interchangeably, though they're not the same thing, would be giving up the contents of your mind, which is testimonial in a way that would invoke the Fifth Amendment privilege. And some courts say, well, if the police already knows that what you have on your laptop is child pornography or evidence of mortgage fraud, if they already know, then it fits within this doctrine called the foregone conclusion doctrine. So the police already knows, so you giving up your password or your key is not going to give them anything new to go after you. Now, in another universe in which the police they have this iPad and they're like, well, you're a bad dude. There's something in it. Hand it over. They don't know what they're looking for. You're not a bad dude. You're so wonderful. But it's hypothetical. Then that foregone conclusion doctrine wouldn't necessarily be as applicable, and in those circumstances, courts have come down the other way, saying, no, it is testimonial to ask you to open this up and give me the contents of it if they are encrypted. And so that development of that doctrine is still unfolding, but what it means at the end of the day is that when it comes to quashing a subpoena for encrypted content, we don't have a slam dunk argument. So we are very vulnerable when it comes to subpoenas for this stuff, and it's a scary universe to be in.
Mm-hmm. Jack, did you have something you
No,
wanted to
I was just curious if this complicates matters. Let's say you're a foreign correspondent and you come back. Let's say you fly into the Fourth Circuit, to Dulles, and there's the border exception rule with searches. I'm sure this makes it even more difficult and terrifying. I have Customs and Border Protection, all of a sudden, we're taking your hard drive now. Goodbye.
Different organizations have been developing different policies around this, but one that I've seen more and more often is having people travel with essentially dummy computers that don't have anything on it.
Burner laptop.
Exactly. Because the border is such a precarious place to be for a variety of reasons, so just don't risk it.
And as we've seen, Jacob Applebaum was one of the first, when he was coming back and forth, noted security researcher, coming back and forth from Europe into the United States, I believe it was, and from the Mideast. He was detained by, I think it was Customs and Border, yeah. And his devices were taken away. He was one of the first people involved in security research and journalism to have his devices seized and to be harassed and detained every single time he entered the country.
That's right. So maybe we should open it up for questions at this point. Yes, Mr. Segoyan.
You don't need a mic.
Since you guys just brought this up, I was speaking to an unnamed New York Times reporter a year and a half ago, and he was telling me that when he entered Israel, the Israeli security, the airport wouldn't let him in the country until he logged into his New York Times email and then allowed him to do keyword searches via his computer to his New York. Sorry. All right. So, retelling it quickly. New York Times reporter, unnamed, speaking to me a year and a half ago. He was entering Israel, and the Israeli authorities wouldn't allow him into the country until he logged into his New York Times email account and then let them do keyword searches on his corporate email account. Now, as he was telling me this, he was really proud of the fact that he used Gmail for everything, and he didn't log into his Gmail account, so there was nothing that they would get.
Subterfuge.
But this seems like a really crazy thing, too, and I understand that this doesn't involve encryption or anything like that, but to the extent that the panelists have thoughts on this kind of practice of not allowing the police to seize your devices, but allowing the authorities in the United States or elsewhere to log in and do keyword searches for your accounts. It seems like a really bad idea. What are your thoughts?
So I can actually verify this because I went into Israel from Palestine earlier this year, and obviously they were interested. And so this is actually I think to a certain group of people, a reasonably known phenomenon, in that what I actually did is I had a web browser open on my computer in a suspended state that was logged into a mail account that I don't care about, which is what I did, because I was actually prepared for the fact that and that was the only way I could think about dealing with the problem, because of the fact that if there's this like, well, we're not going to let you fly out of this airport unless you things start becoming very interesting. I'm really wary of trying to solve real-world coercion problems with code. It can seem really, really appealing, but I have a feeling it leads you to bad places, which I guess is I think if you really know what you're doing, and you bet that you know the security game better than the Israeli border police, which I think is probably not a bet that a lot of people should make, then perhaps you can figure out a way to think through this. But I think the short answer is that if you're going to a place where you have very real concerns, that it sounds like you should consult someone like prior to going. And that doesn't just include a security expert. That probably should include a lawyer as well. And much like getting your shots before you go to the jungle, you should talk to a priest, a rabbi, a security engineer, and a lawyer before you.
Did anybody else, do you want to add anything, or are you?
I was going to give an example of something that does not work in that situation. So I had an activist friend of mine who went to Morocco and was asked to do exactly the same thing, and she said, okay, I'm going to get back on the next plane and I'm just going to leave. I will not cross your border. So if I don't cross your border, you have no authority over me to ask me to do this. And that did not go over well. She was in jail for 3 days. So it's not always a successful tactic, so don't do that. Otherwise, the advice would depend from country to country. It would depend on the resources that are on the ground, if there's anything else that we can set up for you. It's just a really fact-specific inquiry, but it is a thorny one, because borders are pretty terrible places.
Mm-hmm. Next question.
Hi, Kevin Gallagher. I'm curious what you guys think of the current state of institutional news organization security when it comes to actually patching security bugs and vulnerabilities, making sure that people's systems are updated, responding to things like shell shock and heartbleed, and the role of systems administrators and digital security teams in doing that kind of thing.
Sorry, we were distracted because we just noticed something really interesting.
I have so in terms of talking about paying for actual security technology, I'm happy to answer. I think this is a great question. But for instance, this phone, it looks like a reasonably crappy Android phone. They cost like 2,500 euros. And it starts falling into the realm of what I would actually call a real security product. And one of the things that it does is it's really bad for taking selfies and Instagramming and all of this sort of thing. But it is actually a really good cellular network anomaly detector. And so it just threw a warning saying, oh, there may be an IMSI catcher present, which one of the things that it does is it detects if your cell phone is connected to cell towers that don't have neighbors, which is sort of a euphemism for someone that's actually got, and Chris will talk to you at length, I think, about stingrays and that sort of thing if you collar him afterwards, but someone with a... So I'm not sure that this is... also, having used this as a primary device for a while, I've discovered that the cellular network is super brittle and does like all sorts of wacky errors constantly, so it might be that. But yes, I was asked earlier today if people were like, interesting array of people in this room, should we be more worried than usual about this sort of thing? And I was like, I default to caution most of the time, so... But yes, that was what I was distracting people with, was the this is strange.
And now we can take a selfie with my phone.
Yeah.
But his question was...
But can you repeat? You were worried about shell shock
patching
and...
updating, just regular
Yeah,
productivity software?
how do we make sure that journalists are patching their machines and that news organizations are upgrading, responding to when security bugs and vulnerabilities arise?
My answer to that is good luck.
I think having a team that's actually tasked with this is a great point. Like, I mean, that's like the most basic piece of security advice I can give to anyone, which isn't like you should do X, Y, Z. It's like just make sure you're running the latest, most updated version of the software that you're running. That's a really great. So I mean, this isn't just a news problem, right? This is everyone in the world using technology problem. I think that news organizations realize that they have to do that. Is a great start. But I mean, as someone who's actually been doing security engineering and security teams for multiple organizations for my whole career, I'm like, I'd be surprised if news organizations were any better than anyone else at this, which is not good.
Do you think that any news organizations are particularly good at this?
So I was talking before, like, there's been a certain amount of recognition, I guess, or first look for, trying to make a good fist of security posture and that sort of thing. And I think that's great. I think we're doing, a reasonable job so far. I have to admit I have a certain amount of admiration for Bloomberg's security team, who have had a real security team for 10 years. Like, those Bloomberg tablets are pretty secure things, right? Like, and I mean, there's a reason for this. But yes, I mean, I think they're an example of a news organization that are doing all right on a certain front. But obviously, the motivations of the news organization really play into it.
I think it does go to Chris's point, though, of having a chief security officer just creates a locus in the organization of a person that you can go to whose job it is to be doing this all the time, and to be the person that you consult before you fly to Israel or wherever. It makes that formalized in a way that I think is important.
Next question.
Thank you. My name's Matt. There's a lot of talk about having this chief security officer or having this crack team that's going to teach you operational security. It's going to teach you tradecraft and spycraft as well as infosec. Do these people really exist? Are there, not everybody is going to be like a Morgan. So I was just wondering, like, inside a news org or as a freelancer, is there someone you can go to who can give you some Bloomberg-esque assistance?
Be like the EFFs.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of organizations that are doing great work on this. I mean, the Freedom of Press Foundation, and I mean, Runa is over there, and Kevin. I think that they actually have started to do that sort of thing. There's
From
also
the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
There's also, I see Carol over there who's done a bunch of security training for journalists, and I mean, but yeah, I mean, there's people in this room. So I mean, there are resources, and I think I know Europe has tactical tech. What they do here is the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Freedom Press Foundation. So I think reaching out to those orgs and being like, hey, I hear that this stuff exists. What's going on?
And specifically at the Freedom of the Press Foundation website and at EFF.org, there are like tip sheets of tools and practices that are good for journalists.
The surveillance self-defense guide that the EFF released is probably one of the more readable and consumable resources on this sort of thing that I've seen in a while.
And that was very recently updated too, which is nice.
And just, I mean, in terms of security, I mean, even if news organizations don't have like a crack, CISO to, tell you how to do all types of spycraft, I think it's an issue of for better or worse, it's the real world and their priorities, right? I mean, the AP has a wire, and it's a wire that they lock down so heavily that even if I want like to get a feed off of a staging server just to like get for like some analytics thing, nope, good luck. Like you do not have access to that. They put in two-factor authentication so you have like a separate code to put in with your password. I mean, they're very serious about it, but at the same time, it's like, well, how serious are we about social media accounts? I mean, I'm going to be transparent here that,
As the Syrian Electronic Army showed, no one is particularly good at securing.
Of course. And when it came to the AP, I mean, just to be transparent about it, I mean, our Twitter account was hacked, and there was a fake news alert that went out that said that there was an explosion at the White House, and it flash crashed the stock market by like 150 points. Like, and that wasn't even The Wire. I mean, that was our social media account. So I think, and it's not to necessarily blame the AP. I mean, yeah, I mean, we learned a lot from that, but it's like, I think every news organization has their priorities, and is it the priority keeping the wire up and secure? Okay, then there's these like handful of reporters, Jack and a couple other cantankerous folks who want PGP, and maybe I think that's maybe the wrong way to look at it. I'm not saying that's the way they do look at it, but I think it just understanding like the dynamic of a major news organization, it could very well be, I guess what I'm trying to say is they are thinking about it. They read the news just like we do. They have the same boss that the newsroom has, and in our case, he's a First Amendment lawyer, as the CEO of the AP. I mean, they're aware of it, and I think it's just even if there's like a slow-moving train, there are tools that you can use in the meantime and just be smart about it.
Just to use an example, and I'm gonna pick on the AP actually, but I've actually helped compromised reporters from a large variety of news organizations, including most of the major ones. And I'm going to use the AP as an example because the guy's name is Chris Brummett, and he actually wrote about it. But he is the Associated Press reporter on the ground in Vietnam. And he was targeted by Vietnamese government actors that have compromised a whole bunch of people that write on Vietnamese constitutional law from other countries and all sorts of things like that. And they were actually pretty smart about targeting him because they were inviting him to a human rights conference and offering free flights and hotels, which is, most people in this room will admit is, sort of an alluring thing for people in a certain industry. And he ended up contacting me, and I worked with him. And I mean, what was useful about this, as I said, he actually wrote a piece for AP about his targeting by this government. Because most people actually sort of prefer not to talk about it we're sort of slowly moving past that. But I think that's part of it, as you said, people at the top and that sort of thing, they're, First Amendment lawyers, and they understand this problem. I think we're starting to move to a culture where reporters are more inclined to talk about their own targeting, but I think historically there's actually been a feeling of like, we're not the news, we're simply sort of a mouthpiece or a reflection or and I think that's actually really important the reason why I tell this story is because you talk about the importance of the wire and how difficult it is but had they succeeded, and they would be at least inside the newsroom now, right? And then
well, and for a news organization, credibility is pretty much everything you have. It's the only thing you have. And, again, we've been around for 160 years, before really light bulbs or whatever. Certainly before television and the internet. And all it takes is that one hacker or, somebody to put in like a row in a database that feeds the wire that just has like some terribly, horrible, profanity-laced racist thing, and it's over.
I thought it was particularly unfair that the FBI targeted you guys in that. So I was reading Comey's open letter to the New York Times this morning. I thought it notable. For those of you who aren't familiar, the FBI, an agent of the FBI essentially impersonated the Associated Press in order to entrap a teen bomb threat suspect. And just one of the most telling elements of Comey's letter was that they did this because they knew the kid was a narcissist. So I think part of the security lesson here is don't be a narcissist. Yeah. And always be aware that you are dumb enough to be hacked, to be compromised.
This is still about me, right?
and not to mention, when I saw that story, it was horribly grammatically incorrect and not in AP style. So I was like, yeah, right away, that's not, no editor would let that story move ever.
I remember hearing, though, that there was some, I can't remember the source and I can't remember the way that it was worded, but some ancient, Chinese proverb that talked about how if you're ruled by vanity, you will always be vulnerable to attackers who flatter you. So, yeah.
I think that's a great way to wrap up the panel with a Chinese proverb. So thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. And I think we have a short break and then breakout sessions.